go. Okay, so the paper thing, that's okay. This sounds like a drug exchange. Yeah, kind of. So the paper thing, or rather the printer thing, I mean, it's going to be a slight advantage for some people, and I apologize for that. This was not my decision. It's something that the College Board decided. You know, I really think it was something that they didn't have any choice with. Like, you can't stop somebody from pressing print if they have a printer. So it just is what it is. It's one of those byproducts of this testing situation. So that's what we know about the test. Does anybody have any questions about your exam right now? Again, I'll have more information at the end of the month, but I'm trying to pump the information out to you whenever I find something. And by the way, the login process of going in 30 minutes early, that's something that you'll have to do for all of your AP exams, okay? Because they're all going to include a security check. So that's something, yes, I will post what I just shared with you, but that's the security checks, that's something for all of your exams. So if your exams start at 2 o'clock, plan on beginning to log in at about 1:30. Now, if you run into technical problems when you're taking the test, let's say you didn't realize that your computer wasn't plugged in and the battery dies in the middle of the exam, or let's say you're sitting at home and for some reason the power goes out, okay? Something like that, okay? If you run into those difficulties, there is a makeup exam day on June 4th, I believe it is. So you do have an opportunity to take it again, obviously with a different prompt if you need to. Okay, now, from my experiences and from everybody's experiences, the makeup prompt is always harder than the regular prompt. It's always a tougher exam. So I would, under all circumstances, if at all possible, I would avoid that. Okay, I would, you know, very much try on May 21st to be taking the test. Okay. Oh, that's very, very sad, Kayla. Olivia, I'm sure she's fine. Perhaps there was a long line at the Publix. Maybe, you know, she had to keep like her 6 feet from other people or something. And so it's taking longer. I know the other day at Sam's, there was a line out the door. So maybe that's what happened. I doubt she's dead. Okay, so any exam related questions before we jump into Europe? Anything at all about your test or about any of your exams? I will repost that first slide from this PowerPoint because I forgot to start recording when I went over all that. So I'll post the slide this afternoon so you have access to all that information because that was my fault for not pressing record. So any other questions about your exam? Okay. All right. Like I said, as we get closer to the actual exam, I'll be doing a whole lesson about, you know, what you should do and how you should approach and write this DBQ. But we'll hold off on that till we get closer to the actual exam day. Okay, so let's jump into the regular lesson for today, which is all about Europe. Okay, so now we're going to talk about land-based empires, and we're going to go specifically into Europe today. So we've talked about land-based empires in China. We've talked about Arab land-based empires. We even talked about one in Africa. We looked at Japan as a land-based empire. Now it's time to look at what was happening within Europe at the time. And so the European land-based empires generally, Europe during this period generally focuses around two ideas or two significant ideas with regards to the development of Europe. The first is the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, and the second one is the Renaissance. Okay, so those are the two things that we're going to look at today: the Renaissance or the Reformation first, and then the Renaissance. Okay, and so we're going to talk about we're going to talk about that today. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin with the Protestant Reformation. Now, this is a topic we could go on and on and on about for days and days and days, okay, but we won't do that. I'm going to try to keep this a little bit briefer. And so we'll start to talk about that guy right there, Martin Luther, who, as you can see, has a really, really cool haircut. Martin Luther, okay, he was a he was a monk. Okay, so he's raised Catholic, he works in the Catholic Church, he's this monk. Okay, and he one day decides that he has this list of grievances against the Catholic Church, basically things that he feels the Catholic Church is not doing that well. Okay, and he wants the public to debate these issues. He never intended, and this is important because it's a huge misconception among people, he never intended at this point to start a new religion. He didn't want to start a revolution. All he wanted to do was have a debate about these issues. He wanted to have this very academic debate about these issues, and he wanted to have this debate publicly. And so the way that he thought he was going to invite public debate is he was going to put the list of these grievances on the door of the church, beginning in 1517. Okay, and it was literally 95 different points. Okay, and it ends up being called the 95 Theses. So it's like 95 complaints that he has against the hierarchy and the leadership of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, where does this come about? Okay, I think we need a little bit of context here, a little bit of contextualization. During this time period, there were lots of people who were very critical of the actions of the Catholic Pope. Okay, remember that the Pope is at the head of the Roman Catholic Church, still is to this day. The popes were living these very luxurious lifestyles at the time. Okay, they were living in these palaces and wearing expensive clothes, basically, you know, living a lifestyle that was clearly above most of the parishioners. And so a lot of the complaints centered around the idea that they were saying, well, that certainly is not how Jesus would have behaved, you know, or what Jesus would have done. Okay, so that's their first issue, that these popes and these religious leaders are living these very luxurious lifestyles. His second, you know, the second big issue that people had with the church is that they were selling indulgences. Now, if you recall, an indulgence is basically like a ticket to heaven. Okay, and so what does that mean? Basically, if you made a donation to the Catholic Church, the Pope would pray for you, and you could have penalties for your sins taken away. So you could spend less time in purgatory, and you could move straight to heaven. Okay, that was something else that people had problems with. They felt like it was a way for you to simply buy your way into heaven. Okay, and then last but not least, they took issue with the fact that according to the church, the way to get into heaven was through doing good works, okay? Which, by the way, is still a Catholic belief today, okay? Catholics believe, right, if you want to go to heaven, okay, you have to do good deeds throughout your life. And then the thinking is that when you die, there is a judgment where St. Peter, okay, kind of looks at all the things that you've done in your life, and he looks to see if the good things that you've done outweigh the bad. And if they do, then you get moved into heaven, okay? That is salvation through good works. That is a very Catholic belief. Martin Luther says that no, there's no amount of good works that are going to be enough to get you into heaven. And that the only way to get into heaven is by having faith, okay? That as long as you are faithful, as long as you believe, that you are going to get into heaven, okay? And so it's very much a lot more focused on the individual versus the group, right? It's all about, well, if I have faith, I'm going to be okay. Okay, so it's less focused on, you know, what's best for a large group of people, okay? And that's sort of a Renaissance idea too. Now, what does Martin Luther say about this? I'm not going to read the whole quote to you, okay? But notice that he believes, and he's right, the gospel doesn't talk much about good works. Jesus does, but the writers of the gospel don't. They simply quote Jesus, okay? He says anybody who believes that you have to do good works to get into heaven is a liar. And he says, and this is at the end now, he's justified and saved only by his faith in Christ. So it has nothing to do with the good works that you do. This is a very interesting position to take because it's very counter to exactly what the Catholic Church had been preaching for centuries and centuries and centuries, that you have to do good deeds in order to get into heaven, okay? Now, without the technology that had been developed during this time, nobody would have heard a thing about Martin Luther's ideas. Okay, and so it's really important to understand that his ideas, because of the technology, that's the reason that his ideas get spread as far as they do. Okay, and the big one here is going to be the printing press. Without the invention of the printing press, these ideas are going nowhere. It might be a little group of people within Germany who believe these things, and then that's it. It would have faded out. It would have died out. The printing press allowed his ideas to get spread very quickly and very rapidly to large groups of people, including royalty, including kings and princes. Okay, and they're very much going to be interested in these new ideas, specifically because they had long had problems with the authority of the Pope, right? If you're the king, you don't like this idea that there is a religious leader who is above you on that hierarchy. You want to be the top dog in town. You don't want somebody to be above you, okay? And so they don't like that idea, okay? But they are very much interested in a religious system where there is nobody higher than the king, okay? That is absolutely something that they're going to find interesting. And so it does attract the idea of the royals. Now, what makes Protestantism different from Catholicism? Okay, this is a handy dandy chart, and again, this is one of those slides that you're going to want to hang on to, okay, because this slide lists some of the primary differences between the Catholic faith and the Protestant faith. For example, in the Roman Catholic faith, authority comes from the Pope and from the church hierarchy. If you're Protestant, you don't believe that. You believe that religious authority only comes from the Bible. Protestants do not accept the rule of the Pope. The Catholic Church, okay, is very focused on the sacraments, of which there are 7 of them. In the Protestant faith, there are not 7 sacraments, there are only 3. Okay, according to Protestants, the only sacraments there are the ones that come directly from Jesus, which would be baptism, baptism, communion, and confirmation. Okay, so those are the only sacraments. In the Catholic Church, Mary has a very prominent role. Okay, lots of one of the things Catholics do is they pray to Mary. Okay, a lot of Catholics will have a statue of some kind of the Virgin Mary in their home. Okay, Protestants don't do any of that. Okay, Protestants don't pray to the saints. They don't pray to Mary. As I said, they only pray to God. Okay, there is no prayers for the saints. Okay, and then this next one here involves the Eucharist. This is the biggest difference between Catholicism and Protestantism. If you are Roman Catholic, okay, or even if you're Eastern Orthodox Catholic, you believe that at the Mass, the bread and the wine becomes the body and blood of Christ, that the priest performs a miracle and that bread and wine is transformed into the body and blood of Christ. Protestants do not believe that. Protestants believe that the bread and the wine is a symbol of the body and blood of Christ, that it is not transformed to the body and blood of Christ. So that is the biggest difference right there. Obviously, clergy in the Catholic Church remain celibate, whereas in the Protestant faith, ministers are encouraged to get married. Okay, and then again, like we said, in the Catholic faith, saints are very important. In Protestantism, they are not. Okay, so those are the biggest differences. Okay, in fact, in the Protestant faith, saints are kind of looked down on as being idols, and so if you pray to a saint, you are actually engaging in idolatry. Okay, all right. So that's this chart. Might be something that you'll want to hang on to or find, because it really pulls all of these things into one handy dandy little chart that you can refer to. Really quickly, this little hierarchy here, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but this goes into what Christianity looks like. I think a lot of people get confused and they think that if you're Catholic, you are not Christian. That is not the case. Okay, as you can see, all of these different groups are considered Christians. Okay, and so Within Christianity, you have Catholicism, which if you look, Catholicism is only broken down into two groups. You have the Roman Catholics, which is the vast majority of the world's Catholics, okay? Roman Catholics make up something like 75 to 80% of the world's Catholics, okay? So most Catholics fall under the Roman Rite, including myself. And then you have the Eastern Orthodox Catholics, okay? These are going to be in Eastern Europe and in Russia, like the Greek Orthodox are part of that. But then if you look at Protestantism, you see how many different groups there are within Protestantism, okay? And so if you are a practicing Christian and you are not Roman Catholic, chances are you fall into one of these groups. Maybe you're a Baptist, maybe you're a Methodist, okay? Maybe you're Lutheran, okay? Maybe you are considered, maybe you consider yourself just a non-denominational Christian, which would put yourself into the Church of Christ, okay? So Protestantism has many, many different branches of it, whereas again, Catholicism, there's only two. And like I said, the vast majority of the world's Catholics fall under the Roman Rite, okay? All right, so women during the Reformation. So we think about the Reformation, right, as being progress, okay? We think about it as things moving forward. For women, the Reformation actually represented a step back, okay? Because the Reformation did not offer women a role in the church, okay? Whereas if you think about it in the Catholic Church, right, women could become nuns, okay? So there was a religious role for them, okay? Again, in Protestantism, at this point in time, you don't see that. Now, later on, does it become possible for women to become ministers? Yes, but that's later on, okay? Also, Protestants did not pray to Mary, okay? And they didn't venerate Mary. And remember, Mary is probably the most prominent female Christian. And in Protestantism, Mary loses a lot of her status, okay? As do the female saints, okay? Protestants, however, very, very much emphasized women's roles as being wives and mothers, okay? And they used the Bible to kind of justify that. So it is important for you to understand that if you were a woman, okay, things did not improve for you in the Protestant Reformation. Now, once Martin Luther starts this all off, okay, he kind of sets off a chain reaction, and you start to see different Protestant faiths come about. And so Lutheranism is the first one. It's not the only one, okay? Then you get this guy, John Calvin, okay? And John Calvin decides to start his own group of people called the Calvinists, okay? And so what makes the Calvinists different is that the Calvinists believe in something called predestination. And what that means is that it was decided from the moment that you were born, whether you were going to heaven or not, whether you were going to obtain salvation, whether you would be saved. That was decided very early on, okay? And you had no choice, and you didn't know whether you were saved or not, okay? And then what they believed is that you should still do good works, and you should still try to be a good person, because that would prove to the rest of the world that you were one of those who is predestined for salvation, okay? Then we have the situation over in England, okay? England at the time was Catholic, okay, but their king, Henry VIII, he was trapped in a marriage that he didn't like. And the reason he was trapped in a marriage that he didn't like is because his wife was not bearing him a son. His first wife would not give him a son. And in England, the tradition was, and still is, that the throne gets passed to the oldest son, okay? And so Henry desperately needed a son to pass on the throne to. He didn't have that. In fact, it took him 6 different wives, okay? It took him 6 different wives in order to get the son that he wanted, okay? Here's the problem, okay? And here's why this becomes a change in religion. His very first wife was named Catherine, okay? That's her over there on the left. Catherine had a daughter, okay? Henry didn't want a daughter, okay? Catherine's daughter eventually does become the queen, okay? She becomes Bloody Mary, but that's later on. So Henry was unsatisfied with Catherine. Henry wanted to get divorced from Catherine so that he could marry another woman who would hopefully give him a son. The Catholic Church would not grant him a legal divorce, okay, which basically meant that he couldn't remarry without this annulment. When the Catholic Church wouldn't give him what he wanted, Henry decides, you know what? I'm the king. I can make my own church if I want to. And that's what he does. He just decides one day that he's going to found his own church, and he calls it the Church of England. It's now called the Anglican Church, by the way. And yes, it still very, very much exists today. So Henry creates his own church. He says the king will be the head, the king or the queen will be the head of the church, okay? And then he's able to get his divorce, and he's able to remarry, okay? And he marries, as I said, a whole bunch of different times, right? He has 6 different wives, okay? He divorces several of them when they don't give him what he wants. He has a couple of them killed, okay? And then he outlives one of them. So he, really, like, he's one of these people who he keeps trying at marriage until he finds one that he likes. And then it becomes a real problem when he dies, and you have all these different children from all different marriages beginning to compete for the throne. Okay, and so what happens is you have one of his daughters, Elizabeth I. Okay, and then you have another daughter, Mary I, Bloody Mary, who are both competing for the throne at the same time. Mary is Catholic, Elizabeth is Protestant, and you have a whole religious war that takes place within England. But that's a whole other story for a whole other time. Okay, another handy dandy chart here that I'm not going again to go through, but this is a similar one to the other one I showed you, which details all of the different beliefs, but also adds on Calvinism and adds on Anglicanism, which, remember, is the Church of England. Okay, so it just breaks it down a little bit further for you. Now, as all of this Protestant Reformation was happening, the Catholic Church was not going to sit back and just let this happen without trying to do something about it. And so they established what they call the Catholic Reformation, or the Counter-Reformation, and that's set up by Pope Paul III, who you see pictured there on the right. Okay, and basically the idea of the Catholic Reformation is this idea that the church needs to change and needs to deal with the complaints that people had about the church, so that they stop leaving the church and stop becoming Protestants. And so he sets up a Vatican Council called the Council of Trent, which is designed to deal with this. And so some of the recommendations that the Council of Trent comes up with. Number one is they say that it is illegal to sell indulgences, so they prohibit that. They say that you can't buy church offices, and they say that they need to train priests better. So they set up these new seminaries to train more priests, okay? And they try to reform and try to get rid of the clergy members, whether it's nuns or priests, that they believe are immoral. So they get rid of the bad priests and the bad nuns. So really, the whole purpose of the Counter-Reformation was to try to clean up the church, okay? Some of the other things that they do is they create what's called an Inquisition, okay? An Inquisition is a group that is set up to basically, it's a church court that is set up, and it was designed to find people who were being heretics, which means we're speaking out against the church, and to convict them of the crime of heresy, okay? Now, there were some famous scientists who were convicted as part of the Inquisition. Galileo being one of them, Copernicus being one of them, okay? Because a lot of their ideas were very contrary to what was happening in the church at that time, okay? The whole idea of the sun being the center of the universe, that went against church teaching. They also created a list of banned books, what they call the Index of Prohibited Books. Basically, these were books that if you were a good Catholic, you should not read. So they were really trying to control the fallout from the Protestant Reformation, okay? Despite all of that, however, during this time period, Christianity does begin to continue spreading. And one of the places that it spreads to, Catholic Christianity, one of the places that it spreads to, besides the New World, which we'll talk about next week, is a very strange situation in which Christianity makes its way into China, thanks to a group of missionaries called Jesuits. Okay, Jesuits is like a Catholic mission group that is very focused on education. The Jesuits run a lot of schools and colleges throughout the country and throughout the world. I think, as I've mentioned to you before, I went to a Jesuit high school, okay? And so basically what happens is you have this group of priests, these Jesuits, who end up in China, okay? And they are going there as a way, you know, on a mission to spread the gospel, okay? And what they did, okay, is, as I said, they end up in China, and they realize that if they're going to convert the Chinese to Christianity, they are not going to be able to, you know, bang on the doors and say convert or else, okay? They realize that in China, it's going to take a very different tactic to get people to leave Confucianism to embrace Christianity, okay? So they recognize that their tactics are going to have to be very, very different. And so they focus their efforts on the Chinese elite, not the common people, okay? And what they do when they go there is they learn the language, which is extremely important. So they don't go in there saying, you need to learn our language. No, they do it the other way around. And they say, we're going to learn your language. They study Confucianism, okay? And they tell the Chinese, rightly, by the way, they tell the Chinese that they're not there to convert them. They are just there to exchange ideas. They want to learn from the Chinese, and they're hoping that the Chinese want to learn from them. And in fact, the Chinese do. Okay, the Chinese want to hear what the Europeans know about science and technology and map making. So there is very much an open exchange of information, at least at first. Okay, it is a very intellectual exchange. They also, again, they allow the Chinese and have the Chinese and try to incorporate Chinese secular culture into their observances. Okay, and if you look at this picture, you kind of get an idea. These are both Jesuit missionaries, okay? And one of the things that you'll notice is that they are dressed in the traditional Chinese apparel. They are not dressed like European priests. Notice that they are dressed in the traditional Chinese apparel, okay? But again, notice again, with this Jesuit here, notice that there is the Virgin Mary in the background, okay? And so they were bringing Christianity to these people, but doing so in a way that was not forced, okay? Now, they do get a decent number, not a great deal. I would say a decent number of people do end up converting, okay? It is a modestly sized number, okay? They were absolutely much more welcomed among the elites than they were the common people, okay? And so if we're talking about how many converts they actually got, it's anywhere from 200 to 300,000 or so, which in a population that had 300 million people, that's not a lot. It's a small number. Something else that the Jesuits do is they bring Chinese knowledge, of course, back to Europe. Now, by the 18th century, this begins to fall off, okay? And so what happens by the 18th century is you have other missionary groups coming in that are going to start to cause problems, okay? You have the Pope, who now says that he's in charge of all Chinese Christians and that the Chinese can no longer make any sacrifices to Confucius. This very much angers the Chinese, especially the Chinese emperor, okay? And so when the Christians and the Pope start telling the Chinese that they can no longer make sacrifices to Confucius, that's considered idolatry, that's it, okay? And so basically that's going to be the breakdown of the relationship between the missionaries and the Chinese society. And what ends up happening is the Chinese expel the Christians, okay? And so by the 18th century, that's it for the Christians. They are kicked out of China, and they are expelled. Okay, so another important slide here that kind of summarizes all this. If we're thinking about continuities and changes, okay, continuities that we are seeing happen during this period, okay, is that Christianity is still spreading along trade routes. Okay, Christianity is still spreading through the merchants and trade. Okay, and the Roman Catholic Church continues to have a great deal of influence. Now, what do our changes look like? Okay, colonization causes Christianity to spread to the Americas. Christianity makes its way into Southeast Asia because of the Jesuits. Okay, the Protestant Reformation diminishes some of the power of the Catholic Church. That's a change. Okay, so is the creation of all these new Protestant faiths, like Lutheranism and the Baptists and the Calvinists. Okay, those are changes. And then, and then another change is that people begin reading the Bible. Okay, now why is that a change? Well, because prior to the printing press, it was, nobody had their own Bible at their house. Nobody read the Bible. The Bible was read to them when they went to church. The printing press makes the Bible available to people very cheaply, so people start buying their own Bible to put in their homes. Also, the Bible begins to be published in their native language, which means in Germany, the Bible was published in German, okay? In France, the Bible was published in French. Okay, so the Bible was written and was published in the vernacular. That is a change as well. Okay, so that's your very quick and easy on the Reformation. Okay, and now we'll finish up by talking a little bit about the Renaissance. Okay, now it's important for us to note that the Renaissance starts in Italy, and as you can see from the map, pushes outwards from Italy. It is an Italian thing, okay, and it pushes out from Italy. All right, and before we go on, let me take a second. Are there any questions about the Reformation before we move on? That was my fault. Okay, then we'll continue. All right, so the Renaissance, starts within Italy for a number of reasons that we'll talk about in a moment. And again, kind of pushes its way out into Europe, okay, out to the rest of Europe. And so a couple things that we want to note here, okay? We know that Europe comes into the Renaissance at the end of the Middle Ages, okay? So that's sort of when we look at moving into the Renaissance. We know that during the period of time known as the Renaissance, Europe begins a rebirth, which is what the word Renaissance literally translates to. Europe begins a rebirth of these ideas, okay, particularly ideas from the Greeks and the Romans, okay? But it's not just a rebirth, because as you're going to see in a couple minutes, they also develop new ideas, particularly about art and government, okay? And historians generally consider the Renaissance, right, as being the beginning of what we call the modern era. Now, why Italy, okay? One reason why it starts within Italy is because Italy, because of trade, because of the Silk Roads, okay, Italy was a very wealthy country. And so within the cities, the people that are living in the cities, these are people that are extremely wealthy, that have made a lot of money off of trade, okay? So you have a very wealthy people, a very wealthy group of people, particularly in the city of Florence. Okay, Florence at the time is probably one of the wealthiest cities in the entire world. In addition to this upper class, you have within Florence a very thriving middle class of people. You have merchants, you have bankers, craftsmen. This middle class of people is very much embraced by the Italians. So compare that to the Chinese, who didn't like the merchant class, okay? In Italy, they are very much embraced. Okay, and probably the most prominent and most powerful of these families would be the Medicis. Okay, and the Medicis were a banking family. They controlled banking within the city of Florence. Okay, now more about that, because the situation within England is a little bit different. Okay, England is not as wealthy, and so in England, after the plague ends, okay, the peasants that didn't die, the ones that are still alive, they were able to demand much higher wages. Okay, and so they were able to improve their standing and improve their situation. And so many of them realized that they no longer had to live on these manors in, under the control of a lord. And so rather than do that, they go out, okay, and they move to cities and they learn trades, okay, and those trades make them significantly wealthier. So a lot of these old farmers who had survived the plague during the Renaissance, they leave the manor, they move to the cities, and they learn a trade, which again makes them significantly wealthier and gives them a whole lot more options than they had had before, which leads to the belief that they could accomplish much more than they had before. So this pyramid that you see here now, this is the medieval pyramid. This gets thrown out the window during the Renaissance, okay? Feudalism dies out, okay, at the end of the Middle Ages because of the Black Death, okay? And so, and so what you then see at the end of the Middle Ages as we move into the Renaissance is you see Europe looking like this, okay? And you can see Europe being extremely independent, being very, very split up. You have the Kingdom of England and of France, which are the two most powerful empires in Western Europe at the time. Okay, you have the Holy Roman Empire, which would be the Germans. Okay, remember that is the Second Reich. Okay, you have, or no, the First Reich. Excuse me. You have all of these other kingdoms. So Europe is very, very fractured. There's no centralized leadership. Okay, and so what happens is these kings of all these different kingdoms are taxing people quite heavily, okay? They begin to use their power and begin to use their wealth to tax people. Well, at the same time that all of this is happening, England and France begin to engage in a very long, about 116-year war called the 100 Years' War, okay? And so you have now the two most powerful kingdoms within England fighting each other. What that does, okay, is that leads to a great deal of nationalism. People now, instead of being loyal to a lord of their manor, begin to become loyal to the king of their kingdom. Okay, and so you have the French saying that they are French for the first time, as opposed to just being loyal to their local lord. The English are now saying that they are English for the first time, again, as opposed to just being loyal to their local lord. Okay, during this war, you're going to see new weapons. Okay, things like the longbow. The longbow is going to increase the power of the king, but it's going to decrease the power, right, of the local lords. Okay, and so then what happens at the end of the Middle Ages again is you're going to see a decline in the power of the Catholic Church. Why does that decline happen? Well, that decline happens because of something we talked about either last week or the week before, which are the Crusades. Okay, the Crusades weaken the church because remember the Catholic Church loses the Crusades and they also lose a lot of territory to the Muslims. So that's going to further weaken the Catholic Church. Okay, but don't misunderstand this. The Catholic Church is still extremely important. It's not as powerful as it was before, but it's still extremely as important. And so if we think about that, all of those things, this is kind of what this graphic shows, all of those things sort of lead to the birth of the Renaissance. You have all of those things happening below the surface, everything that happened during the medieval period, okay? The idea of returning to the classical period, the fact that travel increases, the fact that the city-states are growing, all of those contribute to the ultimate blossoming of the Renaissance, okay? And so our big change that takes place during the Renaissance is that it's the individual, not the group, that becomes extremely important, okay? And so your social status was dependent upon either how much money you had or how good you were at your job. It was no longer dependent on being born into a prominent family, okay? And this is a thinking called humanism. Humanism is a philosophy which is all about the importance of the individual as opposed to the importance of the group. And so humanism focuses both on religious and non-religious issues, okay, secular and religious. This is also a shift, okay? Humanism is going to be all about the importance of the individual. Okay, it's going to be, again, focused on education for individual people, and focused again on a return to the ideas of the Greeks and the Romans. Okay, humanism is also going to see science become much more prominent. Okay, you have people like Leonardo da Vinci who are going to begin to study the human form in great detail and are going to begin to try to recreate the human form to scale. And so a Da Vinci, remember, of course, is much more than just a painter, right? Okay, he's a scientist, he's a mathematician, he's a philosopher, right? He's all of those things. Okay, and the Vitruvian Man, which you see pictured there, remember, is still an important medical symbol even today, right? If you look at medical logos, you still see that. Okay, and so during the Renaissance, we have this idea of the ideal man and the ideal woman. What is the ideal Renaissance man? Well, it's somebody who is educated, who's smart, who could dance. So I would not be a good Renaissance man because I can't dance. It's somebody who could write poetry and could play music. Okay, this was what was considered to be the ideal man at the time. Now, the ideal woman, okay, should have all of those same qualities. What made her different is that the ideal Renaissance woman should not be seeking fame or political power. That was something that men should do. Okay, during the Renaissance, again, we know that the printing press, right, becomes extremely important. Okay, it makes books available to all people because they become very cheap and inexpensive, so that people who previously could not afford to read or could not afford books now could. Okay, and if you look at the two maps here, you see how literacy spreads as a result of the printing press. Okay, this chart shows where the printing presses were in 1471, and then 29 years later in 1500, you see how it's spread. Okay, and so these books then, of course, become available in everyday language. Now, all of this, if we start to put all of this together, right, we see feudalism declining. Okay, so we're going down the staircase, and then as feudalism declines, we begin to develop and move into the Renaissance. And so those things bring us, of course, into the Renaissance. Now, when we talk about the art, just very quickly, all you need to know about the art is that there are different periods, okay, and that the art changes over time. And so you start with the classical period, which is during the time of Greece and Rome, okay? And so during the classical period, you see a lot of sculptures, a lot of pottery, a lot of murals, and a lot of mosaics, okay? They are idealized versions of people, so they are designed to look perfect, like an Adonis, okay? There's no real perspective here, and they're people looking very heroic. During the medieval period, all of that changes. During the medieval period, okay, you see a shift towards pretty much only painting religious art and religious artwork. The faces, as you can see in this example, don't have very much emotion. They're very flat, they're very two-dimensional, okay? So that's your medieval art. During the Renaissance, notice again how the bodies still look idealized and they still look perfect, okay? But you're now seeing people with a lot more expression on them, okay? So you're seeing a much more serious look at what the human figure looks like. Okay, here's an example. We have medieval art here on the left. See how very flat, very two-dimensional it is, versus the Mona Lisa over here on the right, which is very three-dimensional. Also during the Renaissance, if you look at this painting, okay, this very famous painting called School of Athens, you'll notice that these paintings are designed to appear three-dimensional. They have depth, they have shape to them, okay? They have a vanishing point. The vanishing point, and I think I've talked about this before, is the place in the painting where your eyes are drawn, okay, which you can see there in the middle, okay? And so all of this was designed to give the painting a sense of scale, right, and a sense of depth, okay? Same thing with the Last Supper. Notice that it's very, very symmetrical. And so notice the way Jesus is kind of sitting here in the middle, okay? It comes to like a point at the top of his head, okay? And so again, your eyes are drawn right to the center of the painting. That's what you should be looking at and should be focusing on, okay? There it is in its fresco, okay? Another example, this is the creation of Adam. This is up here on the roof of the Sistine Chapel. So this is something Michelangelo painted, okay? He painted a whole bunch of scenes out of the Bible on the ceiling of this church, okay? Called the Sistine Chapel. Okay, so that brings us to the end, right on time, right on schedule. And so, are there any questions that you have about today's lesson? I know Jan's itching to go play some tennis, I can see. Any questions you have about anything that we talked about today? Nobody? Okay, let me just poke into the chat real quick, see if there's any questions in there. I see we're talking about fish and chips. Somebody told Jan to leave. What show are you talking about? You're on episode 6. Of what show? My Hero Academia? I don't know that show. Is it any good? Jan, you can unmute your mic if you want.
It's amazing.
It's amazing. Is it where can I find it?
It's an anime.
Oh, it's anime? Oh no, forget it. Never mind.
Oh,
You don't like anime?
No, forget it. Oh, never mind. Sorry, Desiree. Sorry, everybody. No, sorry. All right. Well, if there are no further questions, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. We'll end for today. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody. I will see you all on Monday. We'll start Unit 4 on Monday, which will take
Guys, get over here.
Age of Exploration. So we'll do that on Monday. We'll begin moving into Unit 4. Okay. Yes, Mika's absolutely right. Make sure you like, subscribe, share this video if you enjoyed it. No, thank you, Emily. Okay. Have a great weekend, everybody. I'll see you all on Monday. Take care. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.